One. Hi.
Hello.
It's a Saturday. Come on, loosen up. Good news. The curfew has been lifted. So you all can hang out at ACT a little longer tonight.
Or you can hang out with us somewhere around here. Okay, the last day of the conference, we have another prominent speaker in the field of learner autonomy, Professor Phil Benson from Macquarie University. We all know his 2011 book, Teaching and Researching Autonomy in Language Learning. And also last year, 2013, a book on narrative inquiry was out. And at this conference, we also have one of his books as well, with Heyo Renders, Beyond the Language Classroom. You can order the book right outside with the publishers. So Professor Phil Benson, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I hope you don't mind if I stand here because I was just standing up there and you're so far away. It's a bit crazy. Is that okay if I stand here? You can see the slides. You don't need to see me. Thank you first to KMUTT, to the ILA, I think both of whom invited me, and also to Macquarie University for sending me, funding my travel here. And a few people have remembered David Hall. I just want to do, it's the start of the last day, so I just want to do the same thing again in a sense. David Hall is really responsible for us being here and for developing a collaboration between Macquarie University and KMUTT in this area. A personal note, my first book, the book Teaching and Researching Autonomy and Language Learning, was published in a series that was edited by David. And I think what's not been mentioned is that David Hall actually has a very long history with autonomy in Thailand through work that he published when he worked, it was AIT, right? Asian Institute of Technology, yeah? Back in the 1980s. So he has a very long history, both in independent learning and in Thailand. So let's just think about him a little bit during the day. Okay, so I'm going to talk about researching language learning and teaching beyond the classroom. I'm picking up on a comment that Guy Cook made in his opening presentation. I think you said, we assume the classroom. That's the phrase that sticks in my mind, that we often assume a classroom when we are talking about language learning or doing research on language learning. And it's that assumption that I want to try to challenge a little bit, or if not challenge it, at least think about what the world would look like if we didn't make that assumption. What kind of research would we be doing? What kind of ways of thinking would we have? I'm going to start with this, just to a little involvement. Ask you just to think about this. This is a piece of highly unreliable instant research. It's just to ask you to think of a foreign language which you know well, which may well be English for many of you. If it was me, it would be French, I think. But think of a language that you know well, and knowing it well is quite important, I think, here. And just think about what percentage of your knowledge and ability would you attribute to things you did in classrooms and things you did outside classrooms. It's a ridiculous question, because how could you put a percentage on that? But so more than 50% or less than 50%? Who would say more than 50%? More than 50% outside class. Okay. More than 60? 70? 80? 90? Okay, a few hands go down at 90. Anybody? Well, let's be fair. Let's not cherry pick the data. Who would say more than 50% in class? Anybody would say more than 50% in class? Yes, good. Well done. All right. quantitative researcher. I'm afraid I would have to ignore you because you're only one person. Since I'm a qualitative researcher, I won't. I think you're very important. Okay, so point made, I guess. There's all sorts of things wrong with that research. We have a very self-selected sample of probably highly proficient language learners who are capable of learning outside the classroom. But I guess it's just to give us something to think about. How important is this? Why is it important? And I think this is very difficult to say because I would like to see some research which actually really shows how much learning, how much kind of formal learning goes on in situations like distance education, self-instruction, and so on, and how much actually goes on in classrooms. I don't know how you would quantify that, but I have never seen any research of this kind, and I would like to see some research. But a general impression that's shared by many people is that if we go back to, say, the early 1960s, there's a lot more language learning going on. If you take a graph from the 60s up to now, there's much more language learning taking place in the world, and much more of that language learning is taking place outside classrooms proportionately. There's probably a lot more taking place in classrooms as well, just because the amount of language learning is increasing. I have no direct evidence for that, but it's an impression that I think a lot of people would share. It would be interesting to have that kind of evidence. And these are kind of factors that we have. I'm not going to go into them in detail because I've talked about them elsewhere, but there's all the basic idea of the deconstruction of the classroom, that there are all sorts of alternatives to going to a language class that have come up in the last 50 or 60 years or so. The idea of the globalization and the shrinking world, and that there is much easier access to authentic language, either through mobility through travel or mobility through technology. I don't want to talk about that in detail. Claire Cramsh has talked about that in very interesting ways in an article recently in Modern Language Journal. I forgot to mention, this presentation is very reference heavy. There are a lot of references in it, and I will not explain them in detail, but they are listed at the end of the PowerPoint, and the PowerPoint is somewhere on the conference website. I'm not quite sure where. It's also on SlideShare. So if you actually want to see it now, and look at the references now, if you look it up on SlideShare, you can see it there. Okay. An observation that I have made, and I think may be borne out by evidence, is that language learners very often begin in classrooms and continue outside classrooms. They go a certain distance in classrooms, and then they start to learn outside classrooms. And one of the sort of concomitants of that is that, in general, people who've achieved fairly high levels of proficiency in foreign language learning have done a lot of learning outside class. Of course, there are many people who may have only learned a language in class who have very low levels of proficiency. And there may be in my own experience, there is. I learned Latin entirely in classrooms. And apart from the Latin that's fairly spattered around the English language, I remember almost none of it. Yeah. French I continued beyond the classroom, beyond school, and I'm quite proficient in French. Okay, and that's because I learned outside the classroom. One study that I know of, and it's now getting very old and obscure and difficult to find, is a study by Nigel Pickard in 1995, where a very simple study actually is that he interviewed some students in the advanced class at a private schools in the UK, and just asked them what they attribute, how they explained why they were so good, why you were so good. And he found that all of them, in fact, attributed their high levels of proficiency to independent language work outside the classroom. since 1995. And again, it would be interesting if we had more studies of this kind. So this is my theme really, is that it would be great if we had more research in a whole number of areas that are related to out-of-class learning. Okay, now, this, we assume a classroom. And this is, I mentioned in my abstract that most language research, takes place in classrooms. So I thought I would at least try to substantiate that. And what I did was I went through the abstracts and methodology sections of papers published in the Modern Language Journal in 2013. And this is what we came up with. And I'll explain this in a bit more detail because it's a bit more complex than it appears. 30 of the papers are classroom-based. And that figure is misleading, actually, and I'll come to that in a moment. 7 are not classroom-based, which is a way of avoiding saying that they are based outside the classroom. They're not based inside the classroom. But again, I'll come to that. But we can see immediately that most research appears to take place in classrooms if we just look at Modern Language Journal. And another point I want to make about this, though, is because there are 7 papers that are not classroom-based, and there are a lot of journals being published at the moment, if there are, say, 100 journals in our field, that would suggest that there could have been about 700 papers published that were based outside language classrooms. No way to check that. I'm not going to check it. Somebody else can check that if they like. But even the fact that there is a small amount of out-of-class research being published in journals is significant, I think, because there is so much being published at the present time. Now, I've just put this up because in order to try to clarify what I mean by those papers being classroom-based. And I'll just read one of these aloud. Classroom language research, particularly Kathy Bailey, Dick Allwright, Theo Van Leer said that second language classroom research investigates what happens in second language classrooms. Now that's good enough for me because was it 30? The 30 papers that I said were classroom based, they do not all investigate what happens in second language classrooms. And if we look at this, what actually happens is that 9 of the papers investigate what happens in language classrooms. They're concerned with, they're actually investigations in language classrooms of processes that take place in language classrooms. Most of them actually are discourse studies, teacher-learner discourse type studies. Another way of breaking this up now is that 23 of the studies are what I would call variable, measurements of variable studies, like measurements of motivation, measurements of learning strategy use, measurements of anxiety, and so on. Now, the interesting thing is that although these are not studies of classrooms, of the 23 measurements of variable studies, 21 of them used samples of students who were enrolled in language classes at the institution where the researchers work. So, in fact, if we ask, so what are most of the studies that are published in applied linguistics journals? They are quantitative studies measuring language learning variables amongst students who are studying in the same institution where the researchers are working. In this instance, 2 of them use different kinds of samples. Now, one of the questions I want to ask, because I'm actually trying to give a kind of good answer to later, is what does that mean? What effect does that have on what we think we know about language learning? If most language learning takes place outside class, but we only ever use people who are studying in classes as research participants, what does that mean? How does that influence? So now we come down to 5 studies. We have 5 studies which are comparable to the classroom research studies. They're studying processes of language learning that take place outside classrooms. So 5 out of 37. And as I say, that means that most of it takes place in classrooms. But actually, this art of class research is not doing too bad. So, I just said this. What were those studies? What were the 5? Just out of interest. I don't want to pursue this, but what were the 5 studies, just out of interest? One of them was by an author whose name Felicity Cusick told me how to pronounce, but I no longer remember. Kiente, I think. Kiente et al. A Finnish study. The data was transcripts of contestants on Big Brother Finland who were talking about learning English. They were talking about English and learning English while they were participating in Big Brother. It was a social interaction-based study, learning and social interaction. Another was set in, well, let's say this is set in an indigenous language community in Colombia, I think. So it's a community-based study of learning of the indigenous language in the community. It's a language socialization study. A study by Ben Rampton of the discourse of an adult migrant language learner in the UK who had learned English quite late in life while he had emigrated to the UK. A study of the use of Arabic in study abroad. Now I put N equals 18 because there were 18 participants in that study. All of the others were individual case studies, the other 4. So this had a group of students studying abroad. And it was investigating their use of Arabic outside the classroom with their host families out in the street during study abroad. And lastly, we have something similar to the second study, which is about a native indigenous language Canadian community and intergenerational language teaching and learning. So that was what was published, just out of interest. Strange, when I put this on, a cat came in, a real cat came in the door. Can you see it? Do you see what's happening? Some people were here earlier. Which way is it going? Clockwise or anti-clockwise? You're looking from below. Anti-clockwise or clockwise? Has it changed? Has it changed direction? It's changed direction. Sometimes it changes and then it jumps back again. All right, so my abstract. So Ashley, you're feeling really bad now. You just sorry. You can finish this task at home. If you want to try it again, just Google for spinning cat. Actually, it should be the more popular one is spinning lady, but for possible reasons of cultural sensitivity, I use the cat. If you look at it one way, it goes. It goes in both directions. It's supposed to go in both directions. And suddenly it turns around. Now, in the abstract for my talk, I talked about turning this assumption on its head. So here's an example of spinning that assumption round. So what would research look like if we didn't have those, how many was it? I can't remember, 23 studies of measurement variables. What kinds of things would we actually be reading in Modern Language Journal? And I want to ask 4 questions and try to just briefly address 4 questions before I finish. Sorry, could I ask who's keeping time? Because I can't see a clock, or is somebody keeping time here? Good. Oh, I got lots of time. That will be fine. No problem. We have good time for discussion then, I think. So I'm going to ask 4 questions and try to give a brief answers. Very, very open-ended answers to 4 questions. What kind of models would we need? Because I think we need some kind of model. Because the classroom assumption provides us with some sort of model. The classroom is really important and everything else is extra, supplementary. So we need some other kind of model to address that. Where would the classroom fit into that model? Where would measurement, what I've called measurements of variables studies, fit into that model? And lastly, what kinds of research would fill out what would the editors of journals be really looking for, instead of saying, that's not very good, we'll reject that. What would they be actually really looking for? Okay, now I want to introduce from the introduction to the Learning Beyond the Classroom book that I edited with narrators. A very rudimentary model that I think is oversimplistic. It needs to be extended. But it was originally, I came up with it because we have all these terms. On the right-hand column, we have all these terms. Like, we came up with the term learning beyond the classroom. But there's things like out-of-class learning, out-of-school learning, informal learning, non-instructed learning, self-directed learning, and so on. So the model was to try to make sense. So each of those terms, what is it actually talking about? What does the term refer to? If we work from these terms, then maybe we can see particular dimensions of learning beyond the classroom that are being highlighted by those terms. So the 4 dimensions were location, formality, pedagogy, and locus of control. And in relation to location, or setting, if you like, it's simply where does the learning take place? And this corresponds to terms like out of class or which are purely referring to a location, but not saying very much else. Formality, which described as being the degree of structure that is involved in the learning. Formal learning is often described as learning that involves qualifications. But qualifications are a kind of structure, so I think more generally we can talk about how structured the process of learning is. Is it leading to some definite endpoint, which means that you have to then sort of follow a particular sequence or complete particular things. Pedagogy, the senses in which teaching is involved, which corresponds to non-instructed and instructed. And one of the most interesting things we came up with when we actually had to write an introduction to all the papers that we edited for this book was the extent to which teaching is actually involved. Pedagogy is involved in many, many instances of what appear to be out of class, naturalistic almost learning. For example, there are now quite a few conversation analysis type studies of learning in interaction. Where you see that if you are learning by having a conversation with somebody, quite often one person is teaching the other person. Whether that's a non-native, native speaker interaction or even non-native, non-native speaker interaction, you get quite a lot of teaching and learning going on. Lastly, locus of control, which we're on familiar ground in this conference, I think. Self-level learning is self-directed or other directed. Now, the point about this model was that the idea that you could take any particular type of learning, let's say it was a distance education program, or let's say it is a trip to the country of your dreams where you can actually use the language that you've been learning for so long. Any particular instance of this, what you will have is a setting and then other variables of formality, pedagogy, locus of control that will come into play in that particular setting or in a particular instance of learning in that setting. So if you want to describe learning beyond the classroom, a particular instance of learning beyond the classroom, you can begin with the setting and then begin to look at the other dimensions. There are clearly more than 4. How many? I have no idea. Maybe it doesn't matter how many there are. But there are clearly more than 4. And others that occur to me and have occurred to other people is the mediation of the learning, and what kind of texts are involved, what kind of artifacts or resources are involved in the learning. The modality of the learning, which I'm just using, but I don't really know what modality means. I just use them, but basically there are things like, is the learning actually form focused, or are you trying not to pay attention to the forms and the grammar and just sort of enjoy yourself and soak in the language? Is it reading based? Does it involve reading? Does it involve conversation? Is it interactional? So that's what I mean by. I've used the word mode of practice elsewhere to talk about this. Dimension of sociality, basically whether you're learning alone or whether you're learning with other people. And if you're learning with other people, how are you learning with other people? I think David Pulferman is pursuing very interesting avenues here through social network theories. In a paper, this is a paper from our Beyond the Classroom book, but I think he's published this elsewhere as well. A linguistic dimension concerning what kinds of language are involved, maybe what levels of proficiency are involved in the learning. And lastly, one that my partner Alice Chick, she wrote a paper on learning through digital gaming, and she actually used this model, but she added this dimension called trajectory, which concerned with how, well, it adds a time dimension to it. And in the case of using digital gaming, she was looking at people who had been learning English using digital games since they were about 5 or 6 years old. So the trajectory was concerned with the different ways in which they had used games and the ways that had developed over about 10 years of learning while playing digital games. Okay, so that's a model. That's the kind of model we need, and I'm interested in other dimensions that I'm sure there are. Because I've thought of 3 of these in the last few days when I sat down to really reconsider that model. So I'm sure there's lots more. Where does the classroom fit into this kind of model then? Well, I think simply is that any setting can be described in terms of formality, pedagogy, etc., all of these dimensions, and so can classrooms. So from that perspective, classroom, from the perspective of this kind of model, the classroom is just one setting, like any other setting, but there are sort of hundreds of them outside the classroom, and then there's the classroom. Or perhaps there are different kinds, there are also different kinds of classrooms, of course. So the classroom is one setting among many that are likely to be available as affordances for learning. And we can look at that both horizontally within a sort of spatial environment. We can look at, not at the classroom, but we can look at all of the settings that are available as affordances for learning. We can ask the question, okay, we're in Thonburi, are language classes at KMUTT, so that's one affordance. But there will be many, many other affordances. So if you look at this horizontally, we will be looking at all of those affordances, including classrooms and affordances outside the classroom, that will be available in this particular environment at this moment in time for, say, a student at this university. Maybe a student in Hong Kong, or maybe a Thai student in Sydney, Australia, the map would be very different. Somebody used the word landscape in the context of self-access yesterday. I like that term. The landscape would be very different. So this is the horizontal way. Vertically, we would look at that within a temporal environment. Can you have a temporal environment? Yes or no? Happy with that? I'm not sure what word to add to temporal there, but we call it a temporal environment, but which is looking at the same thing for a particular person over a particular time. So I mentioned, for example, we could talk about KMUTT students here in Thonburi, or a Thai student in Sydney. Well, that could be the same student now and in 2 years' time. So we can look at those affordances from the point of view, sort of geographically, spatially, in terms of a landscape, or we can look at them in terms of time, from the perspective of individuals. And the classroom would fit in there, clearly. So I'm trying to colonize classroom research for out-of-class research. Okay, now where would measurement studies fit in? This is really interesting, and I just came across this. This is pure coincidence that I came across this looking at Modern Language Journal. And it's something I found very, very interesting. There are two studies in Modern Language Journal, 2013, which have revived language aptitude. Seems to be a thing to do now, is to revive language aptitude studies. We suddenly begin to realize that not everybody can become fluent in a foreign language. That maybe there are differences in aptitude or basic ability to learn. I'm not quite sure exactly what aptitude means. I don't think anybody is, but there you go. So this is concerned now. Sorry, I'm going to look at three things. One is the two aptitude studies. I'm also going to just mention something about schools and classrooms as affordances for measurement of variables, and then the question of what are variables in out-of-class learning. So let's look at the aptitude studies. Now, the first was by authors Thompson. I'm not really getting to the point of these papers. I'm cherry-picking something out of the papers. If you're really interested in this, read the papers and decide for yourself. Now, Thompson, the sample was 79 Brazilian language learners in Brazil. They were in Brazil. Who were attending classes at a university-affiliated English language program. So they're Brazilians in Brazil. They were studying English at university. They used the foreign language aptitude test. It's called the Canal FT. It's a different test to the second paper, which complicates things a little bit. And they were interviews on their language experience. What experience have they had, either in terms of knowledge, bilingualism, or knowledge of more than one language before they came to university. The second study, now this is where it gets interesting, took 88 students who were studying psychology at Boston University. Now, 56 of those students said that they had never managed to learn a foreign language. And later they call them monolinguals. I don't know if that's reasonable or not, but they self-reported that they had not been able to learn a foreign language successfully. 25 were early bilinguals. Bilinguals were very young age, and 7 had learned about 2 for everyday interaction. Now, so the point is that these students were not, well, they may have been enrolled, but I don't think they were enrolled. It doesn't say that they were enrolled in language classes. They were enrolled in psychology classes. And a whole number of them declared that they had not been able to learn foreign languages. The aptitude test was a different test, the MLAT, Modern Language Aptitude Test. And something I'm not going to cover is that the actual So in the first study, they found that the amount of previous language learning experience had a positive effect on the results of the language aptitude test. That is, if you have experience of learning a language, you will have more language aptitude. Okay? They use this as evidence that aptitude is not a fixed thing. It's dynamic, it changes over time, and it's influenced by your experience. The second one, and this is what's really interesting, is they found that the people who have failed to learn a foreign language have higher language aptitude than people who are bilingual. Why? Well, they only speculate, because that's not the purpose of their paper. They only speculate, but they speculate that the language aptitude test measures cognitive abilities that help learn a foreign language in a classroom setting, and thus may not be most valid for monolingual English speakers. Now, this is a really interesting point, I think, because it's telling us that, I mean, there are several issues here. First is that the location of the study clearly influences the sample. And in these studies in modern language journal, there is a very, very clear influence on sampling because samples are about 80% of the time coming from people who are enrolled in language classes. But in this case, when you include out-of-class learners, or in this particular aptitude test, people who have not learned foreign languages, then it shows that there's some sort of bias in the instrumentation towards classroom learners. So we're not really looking at language learning at all. Quite often we're looking at people in classrooms and finding out how they're learning classrooms. And just the other question, the other issue that's raised in these papers is there's a couple of studies of foreign language anxiety. And perhaps you know what is the most common scale that is used to measure foreign language anxiety. It's the foreign language classroom anxiety scale. But results are generally interpreted as being more generally about foreign language anxiety, not about anxieties that are produced by being forced to sit in classrooms for day after day. Okay? More generally, I think we can just say that the context in which research is conducted also influences findings. Perhaps we can, I'll let you read this yourself. This is something that Larson, Freeman, and Cameron say from the perspective of complex systems theory, or complex adaptive systems theory. Now, we know, for example, that if one person interviews somebody and another person interviews somebody, they will say different things. Or different people who witness the same event will tell different stories about that event. But what I find interesting about this, from the perspective of complexity theory, is that this is not simply, what they are arguing is that it's not simply a question that people know the same thing, they have the same knowledge, but they present that knowledge in different ways, in different contexts. But that actually the knowledge is different because knowledge is a process, knowledge emerges in whatever interaction or context you're in. It's not a thing. Therefore, the knowledge is actually different in different situations. The thing that we're studying actually changes according to the situation. So, to conclude this point on measuring variables, it's very problematic. Particularly if you're only interested in what happens in classrooms, okay, no problem. But if we accept that a lot of learning takes place out of classrooms, and we want to try to apply the findings of these studies to learning outside the classroom, this becomes very problematic. Now, the implication of that may be that we should do more measurement studies outside the classroom. The problem here is, of course, is that when we look at those studies in Modern Language Journal, most of them have, measurement studies rely on samples that are greater than 30. And statistically, it's very interesting that what's normally required for a good statistical Because where can we find samples above 40? Well, we find them in classrooms and schools. So there's a convenience factor there. And also the convenience factor in out-of-class studies tends to mean that they're either ethnographic, involving participation in some out-of-class setting, or they're individual case studies. So one could argue that there should be more measurement studies conducted outside the classroom, and probably there should, but on the other hand, you could argue maybe there should just be fewer measurement studies altogether, given the extent to which journals like Modern Language Journal appear to rely upon them. So, if we take those measurement studies out, what can we replace them with? Oh, sorry, one additional point I wanted to make there was that apart from standard instruments being designed for classroom intervention, which means that variables such as aptitude or strategy use and motivation so on would present differently if they're investigated outside the classroom. There are a number of studies, measurement studies conducted outside the classroom, which are actually looking at different kinds of variables. And one that I wanted to mention was a study from a few years ago by Kai Nino, and she was studying people in Japan who follow these broadcast radio and TV language courses. And here the variable was persistence. So here's a very particular variable that comes into play, and it's a sort of psychologically validated variable, etc., etc. It's a very different kind of variable than we would look at in classroom-based research. Okay, what kinds of, this coming to the end now, what kinds of studies would we find? And again, this is a brainstormed list with a few examples. I think there would be fewer measurement studies. There would be more quantitative descriptive studies. The contents of the journal would look, I think, a lot like the program of this conference. Yeah. There are comparatively few measurement type studies. There's a lot more qualitative research. There's a lot more research on processes of learning. There would be a lot of studies of learning in specific settings. I think it's important that we conduct more of these kinds of research. Now, there are a few people who have been systematically plowing this furrow of learning outside the classroom for many years. Gareth is one of them. Another one I'll mention is Andy Goucher as well. He's published a whole number of interesting studies about language learning outside the classroom. Now, Gareth, this is a reference to a paper from the book that Gareth has recently edited, but I think it's probably similar to the paper you presented yesterday. Yeah. And it's using the theory, using semiotic theories of studies, which I think are important in this kind of research. Andy Gou's studies are, I forget which one is which. One is a study of English corners in Chinese universities, so English corners, and the other was a study of a language cafe, but not a language cafe that had been spontaneously set up by language learners in a cafe. It was a real cafe. Yeah, not the kind that we set up in universities, which often don't have anything to eat. What I would call horizontal or ecological studies. And David Palfreman again, and also Vera Menezes are very interesting on the kind of applying theories of social ecology and complexity to out-of-class language learning. A couple of very interesting studies. One was by Martin Lamb, which is a very well-known study now, where he actually studied how sort of learning fit together for young people in a particular, learning English fit together in different contexts for people in an Indonesian town. I think a number of us would know that study. A recent one, I'm not even sure if it's published yet, but it's in the Innovation in Language Learning and Teaching, is a Hong Kong-based study by Chun Lai, who is based on interviews showing that students allocate different functions to classroom and out-of-class learning as well. So that's an interesting study. what I'm particularly interested in, and I won't go into it in any detail, are vertical narrative type studies of language learning histories and experiences. And I'm really happy that there have been so many of those kinds of studies presented and discussed at the conference today. We published learning English and digital gaming. We would also have a lot of learning and interaction studies. A couple of those I've cited here were of interest. Some of them, a lot of these are based on conversation analysis and deal with face-to-face interaction. And actually, these are the kind of journals, these are the kind of articles on out-of-class learning that are predominantly being published at the moment in journals. I think because they're based on conversation analysis, and it seems sort of scientific, that's the wrong word, but it's a well-established methodology. But interestingly, I think there are also, the Todini 2007 study is interesting because it's looking at that in online interaction context. And I think that there's a very ripe field for research which will look at how students interact with each other through technologies and how learning takes place in those kinds of contexts. I've been working on that myself recently, and some of you may have been to presentations I've done on YouTube comments on how students interact and how people interact and learn through YouTube and YouTube comments. And finally, I think the roles of teachers and classroom teaching are important. And again, I have to dig back in history to find this. An article by Stephen Ryan, which was in a book that Peter Voller and I edited, a really, really interesting paper in which he designed a course in a fairly, what would be a sort of, a city in Japan where apparently there was no English. You couldn't find English. And he designed a course which would help those students who were adult students preparing to go overseas, which would help them to find those resources in their community and use those resources. Now, again, I haven't come across any studies similar to this since then, but the course itself, it seems to me, is a kind of model for how we can integrate, well, at least it's a starting point for how we can integrate teaching, classroom teaching, and out-of-class learning. And lastly, a recently published paper, which is a different kind of approach. I think it's called Learning English by Walking Down the Street, and it's a different kind of out-of-class language learning based on linguistic landscape research, which involves actually taking your students outside the classroom. So physically removing them from the classroom and taking them somewhere where they can perhaps learn more than they would if they stayed inside. Okay, now I think that's the end. Yeah. There's a whole lot of references here, which you can see if you download them. So I think I've gone on longer than I wanted to, so I won't give a long conclusion, except to say that I would say that I hope we have more research. Before I came to the conference, I would say that I would really hope that we can have more research of this kind. But of course, at the conference, I've seen lots of research of this kind, which is great. So the next thing is, how do we get it published? I think that's probably the important question. So thank you.
Questions from the floor?
Thank you very much for your inspiring talk. It is very relevant to myself, actually, because my research area is in language learning in private supplementary tutoring, which is called shadow education, because it's like mimicking the mainstream education. And I remember your book also mentioned a little bit about that, your 2011 book, Private Tutoring. So, but my question is like, so private tutoring is happening so-called outside the classroom, but I think it is in the gray area, because for the location, it is in a classroom setting. For the formality, it is quite formal because it's like teacher lecturing. And the locus of control, well, the teacher is taking a lot of control. And for the pedagogy, so it is mimicking the mainstream education. But time is a little bit different because it is not happening in the mainstream lesson time. It is happening after class. So my question is, how does shadow education fit in? It seems to me it is like a gray area.
Well, I think the article that I've got here at the bottom of this slide by Martin Lam has a really interesting analysis of that, because in this particular Indonesian town, one of the main things he finds is they go to school during the day and go to English lessons and don't pay very much attention, actually, and the teachers are quite frustrated. And then after school, they go off to the tutorial classes, which they think are much more valuable, and so on. So the teachers in the school, in the state school, were quite depressed by this. They were saying, like, what's the point? Why do we need to teach them here? Why don't they go to tutorial school? And then when he interviewed the kids who were going to tutorial school, they said, well, no, not at all. If they didn't have the classes at school, we wouldn't go to tutorial school. Yeah, we wouldn't need to go there. So he analyzed that in terms of a kind of ecology. So I can see there is an anomaly, right? If you're learning in a classroom and then you go outside and you learn in another classroom, what's that about? Is it out of class or classroom? I think it doesn't really matter, because if we have a model, I mean, you just tried to use that model to describe that, and you described it very well. So I think what we need is a kind of model that allows us to analyze what's really happening in those kinds of situations. Not necessarily the one I presented, but you did just make it work rather well in that situation. So I don't think it really matters to decide whether tutorial school is in class or out of class. Clearly, it depends on the overall sort of ecology. And the important question is how those two fit together, fit in with other things
I realize you said that there were lots of other ways of categorizing things which you couldn't include. But one which strikes me as central is the learning versus use. What is the user's or learner's prime purpose? I think a lot of the learning, when you ask people, where did you learn? And most people put their hands up for outside class. I would guess that quite a lot of that is because they were wanting to use the language and the learning was incidental.
Yeah.
But you're using learning all the way through your talk. Would you include this sort of use plus incidental learning as part of learning?
Absolutely. Yeah, of course, yeah. Well, okay, maybe when I write, I often write language learning and use, but in talking I think you're right. In talking, I just didn't do that. And I think learning and use is very important. In that kind of model, maybe that would fit in under modality. But what I need to say is that it's not. I didn't leave things out because I didn't have time to talk about them. I left them out because I don't know what they are. Yeah. And I see this kind of model as being very, very rudimentary, because nobody's ever tried to come up with this kind of model before. So, this is not going to be right. Maybe we'll get something, more stable over time. But absolutely, yeah. Would it fit in under the idea of modality? Whether you're focused on learning or whether you're focused on use? Would it? I don't know. Or maybe it's an independent dimension. Yeah, maybe.
Thanks very much. A thing that interests me about, this very rich description of increased opportunities for learning outside the classroom is what effect that ought to have on what happens inside classrooms, and the way that, in my view, it doesn't, okay? So in the past, there's been, and in the present, there's something of an obsession in classrooms and in classroom materials with providing students with authentic language, real language, simulations of authentic communication and so on. But it seems to me that now that there are so many opportunities for authentic interaction outside the classroom, and that's what people are doing, that the classroom should change its line and be providing the more form-focused, explicit instruction which would form a kind of solid basis for real interaction outside. So is there any, so if I turn this, this statement into a question, I mean, is there any work on how understanding of out-of-class learning might influence in-class learning? Do I make sense? Yeah.
Well, the answer is I don't know whether there is or not. I have not really come across work like that. The very last paper, I think, that I mentioned by the Chun Lai in Hong Kong is looking at how students divide this up, how students organize their sort of resources. And I think that article comes to a pretty similar conclusion, is that they expect something that's more form-focused from classes. They don't particularly expect their classes to be replicating things that they can do by themselves outside, yeah. Because a kind of obvious and probably wrong conclusion is that we should be putting more out-of-class learning in classrooms, isn't it? And I think that is probably wrong. I don't know if anybody else would know of work that's studied that, but I don't.
Her PhD thesis was about tandem learning, and there's this girl who was engaged in tandem learning outside classroom, and then she sort of started to differentiate how she relates to the classroom learning. I mean, so, ne? Am I making sense?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so rather than taking this in a interaction with native speaker into the classroom, she started using the classroom experience to benefit to tandem learning. So, I know, obviously she finds different functions to different settings.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's similar to the study, the Hong Kong study that I
Yeah,
mentioned.
yeah,
So
yeah.
I think
So-
what you're saying is studies that actually look at that from the perspective of teaching or even curriculum. What should be happening in the classroom? What's the best way to use the time in the classroom?
So can I make a comment?
And that whereas the one but the one I mentioned, the one you mentioned, are coming at it from the perspective of learners.
We shouldn't expect any particular way of learning to be able to do everything that needs to be done in terms to acquire language. So, tandem learning has limitations. There are things that tandem learning can't do, but also classroom learning also had things that they can't do. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's flawed. I mean,
No, it doesn't. No,
no,
I don't think it
so,
does.
So I think we have to sort of reformulate our concept of methodology or pedagogy or whatever. Nothing has to be nothing has to be perfect. Everything has a limitation, and we kind of combine them into one, like you said, life of one person, one learner, and then that will make a whole.
I think maybe the issue, the question, the challenge to what guys you've just said is, do we need form-focused instruction at all? And that may be where Naoko is coming from. That maybe we just don't need that at all. I think Rod Ellis would agree with you, though, right? I'm sure. Yeah. So I don't know, but I think I definitely agree that the whole trend in curriculum and pedagogy is to say, bring the world outside the classroom into the classroom, and maybe that's just sort of the too obvious answer, because maybe that's not actually what students would want, how they would want to divide things up. Yeah, Roger.
Just reflecting on what Guy said, that bringing back the form into teaching is a good idea, because the students can bring in the authentic materials which are not authentic in course books. They're pretty rubbishy stuff, aren't they? They're still talking about Princess Di. Who? But they can bring the authentic materials that interest them, and the teacher can then tie that in with the form focus he's particularly looking at, whether it may be narratives or modality or whatever. And then, of course, they can interact online authentically among themselves. They don't need to have a communicative classroom. So, in fact, the essential classroom could be form focused, because I do think, actually, students need to be accurate from time to time. So I think the classroom is very much a support for real learning outside.
Okay, I'm afraid time's up.
Oh.
We can have this discussion later during breaks or lunch. Okay, so may we have Ajahn Ponnapit to present Phil with a token of appreciation.
Okay, before the break, we again have a few announcements. The poster fair at the back is still open during the coffee break and the lunch break. So if you missed it yesterday, please, pay a visit to the fair. We found this as well, an MP3 and also a stick. So if it's yours, then I'll leave it at the information desk right outside. Okay, thank you. I have a bunch of receipts here with me, so please collect them if you need them. I'll leave them at the information desk as well.
Also, can all the presenters send your PowerPoint files to Richard? So they will be available on the conference website next week onwards. Also, Professors David Gardner and Lindsay Miller's book, Managing Self-Access Learning Center, is available for purchase right outside with 20% discount. And please also be reminded that Sarah Toogood's session at 11:20 is moved to Sunday, she said, to 2:40. The room is 505. And today's pickup time is 3:30. And also the last announcement will be made by Richard.
Okay, she just asked, can all presenters please send me your PowerPoints? We will put them up on the website. Phil just now has been talking about in-class versus out-of-class learning. We would also like to try in-conference versus out-of-conference discussion. So once we could set up the PowerPoints, we will set up discussion boards associated with them. And yes, you'll need to register, but hopefully we'll set it up in a way that when you enter the site, you will be told which boards, which PowerPoints have active discussions going on since you last entered. So hopefully within about 2 weeks, we will send everyone, speakers and participants, if we've got your emails, we'll send you a message that this site will be up. So please visit and contribute and discuss the PowerPoints as a starting point for an ongoing discussion. Yeah, Steve?
Yes, actually, I still have one last thing to say. But that's all the housekeeping for now. But, the organizing team would like to share with you a few things. We have received very good feedback from you, and we would like to say that it's because of you. We don't want to sound cliche, but it's all because of the, punctual registration, very few cancellations, despite the, the current situation. So we'd like to thank you for all the, for being such good sports, and thank you for your flexibility, punctuality, and civility. And most importantly, we'd like to say a big thank to the Iron Lady behind all this, Sontida ค่ะ And if we've done such a good job as MCs, please say so in the evaluation form. It won't affect our paycheck, but it kind of is good for our ego. Thank you. Enjoy conferencing.
Excuse me, I was going to do this individually to people, but I was just asked if I would say something in public. I just want to say thank you so much to the organizing team, obviously the people at the head of the pyramid, but then the graduate students and everybody who is involved, the people on the front desk. You've made this conference so pleasant. And somebody told me that I've been coming to conferences here for the last 12 years. I didn't realize it, but one thing I do realize is that I have been telling people around the world that this university gives fabulous mini conferences, and if you ever have an opportunity, you should plan to attend one. So now you can go and do the same thing, because they will be having other conferences, I'm sure, in the future. I see a horrible look came over the face of the conference organizer. She would probably like to have a rest first. But anyhow, I just want to say, on behalf of everybody, thank you. Thank you so much.
Very much.